This is Hunt Nebraska, the official podcast for insight into Nebraska's hunting and shooting sports community. Be sure to give us a follow on Facebook, our space for sharing stories, information, tips, and techniques. Now, Hunt Nebraska. And welcome back, everybody, to the Hunt Nebraska cabin. We appreciate you taking us along for the ride, the hunt trip, the shooting range venture, wherever you might be headed right now. We appreciate that. For those of us joining on YouTube, you probably noticed that there's somebody else sitting in the cabin today, which is pretty cool. We've got Andrew Little, Assistant Professor of Wildlife and Habitat Management in studio, along with the Kayla, pushing the boards and buttons and all that type of stuff, and Hunter from our Hunter Ed department, and myself, Hershey. So this is going to be a fun one.
Sure.
We're going to try to put on our scientific hat as best we can here, and that's why Hunter's wearing this blaze orange hunting Hunter orange hat? I probably should say that. It says Hunter Education on the side, getting ready for the Cornhusker trap shoot here in just a bit. First of all, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, and glad to join. Thanks so much for the invite.
Well, you're diving into a lot of neat things in the wildlife world.
Yeah.
We're going to focus on just one little piece of it.
Yeah.
I'm sure you got several projects in the back pocket right now.
And really, one of the big things, our lab, we're called the Awesome Lab, Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab. So you had to come up with an acronym for such a long name.
Another acronym.
Another acronym. But what we really focus on is finding ways we can actually implement conservation and intensive agricultural landscapes for wildlife and other natural resource sides of management. So,
and Hunter, what did he just say?
Something pretty awesome, I'll tell you. At least it's a good acronym.
Yeah.
Some of the acronyms out there.
And part of my position, so 60% of my position is extension. So I work a lot with landowners, and so finding that balance, working with landowners to find the balance in production ag systems for conservation enrollment. So and ideas like that.
All right. Well, and like I said, I think we've got several podcast ideas here just as we go through. You could probably talk on a lot of subjects, but we're going to zero in on something that is interesting to us right now and a lot of folks talking about it, and that's that wild turkey research that you've just started kicking off this year, multi-year project, which we'll get into here in a bit. But I want to take a step back and kind of put it in context just a little bit. I think for turkeys, it's one of the only birds or one of the few things that we hunt that we really zero in on that breeding season, for one thing. And two, we just kind of assumed, well, we can manage them a little bit like pheasants, right?
Yeah.
One big gobbler, all these hens, polygamous, take one out, another one will replace it. And we've kind of been buffered a little bit here in the great state of Nebraska because our populations were so high there for a while as they filled in the habitat and took advantage of some opportunities. But obviously this is something not only interesting here in Nebraska, but nationally is a little bit of a decline in turkeys. So let's start from the beginning. What spurred this on?
Sure, yeah. So working with Luke Meduna and others with Game and Parks, we basically, looking at the data that's been collected for a number of years, started observing those declines. So about 15 years ago in Nebraska, that was kind of the peak in the population growth. And then since then, things have been on the decline. I work a lot with landowners across the state, and you kind of see various aspects of that decline. Some places you see large flocks. Other places people were saying, I haven't seen birds here for quite a while, or only see a handful of birds compared to 10 years ago.
Okay.
So basically on the data really drove that conversation around needing that project. So.
That's always interesting how, follow the need. What's going on. And I got to say, when I moved here to the state of Nebraska a little over 15 years ago, turkeys they were at the peak. I heard a lot of folks complaining more about how many or having to slow down the tractor pulling the planter and stuff to let that whole big flock pass by. And now those same farmers are saying, I haven't seen them. They've moved on, or they're not here anymore for whatever reason. But this is something that we can tie into some larger things as well. So walk us through this. What is the purpose of this? All right, turkeys are in decline. What is this project doing?
Yeah, so this project just really as a whole is trying to address what are some of those factors that are leading to that decline. And I would argue that it's they're a game bird. So obviously there's a lot of things, unfortunately, like pheasants and quail. It's kind of like a death by a thousand cuts. There's usually not one thing like predators or disease or whatever. It's usually a combination of factors that affect their population growth rates. So really, the project's looking at multiple things to kind of address that. We're looking at things from like nest survival. So are those nests surviving? Are they not? Where are they nesting at? What kind of cover are they nesting in? How far are these birds moving on the landscape? Are we seeing 10-mile movements? Are they kind of homebodies? What does that look like? And because we don't really have any previous data, particularly GPS data, like you'd have your phone tracking you, you don't really have that information to go off of. So we don't really have a lot of information to kind of say, here's kind of where we need to start. And so we're kind of doing more of a multifaceted approach, similar to some other states across the nation, to look at these various factors that potentially could be, affecting their decline. So.
Wow, that's quite a bit.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a very multifaceted project for sure.
Yeah, I guess so. I think I've heard Luke Meduna call this the kitchen sink wild turkey research. Because really here in Nebraska, we have some, but not a lot of research done in the past.
Yeah. It's been outside of the agency, the data that they collect each year or every couple of years, that they're getting that information, like the mail carrier survey data that kind of helps them make those decisions on where the bird's tracking over time. There really hasn't been a lot of other additional information collected, so this is an opportunity to start pulling all that information together.
And that mail carrier survey, we've relied on it for quite a bit for a lot of different species, but it's an observation only.
Correct.
And it doesn't mean that these 12 turkeys that you see now are the same, when you see 15 later.
Sure, absolutely.
So that's interesting.
You mentioned that there are several other states looking at this. Obviously, Nebraska is not unique to seeing turkey declines over the past 10, 15 years. Is that part of the project that it's going to be looking at all these different states and looking at that data jointly? Or
So we've been working with some other states, particularly one of the actually collaborators on this project is Mike Chamberlain, who's really well known in the wild turkey realm. Wild Turkey Doc, if you're on Instagram, you can follow him on there. But he's been very involved in a lot of these different projects across the country. And more recently, we've been actually connecting with some of our neighboring states who are working on turkey declines and kind of saying, hey, we can start collecting data across state boundaries as well and start addressing some of these common questions that all of us are having. So, it's definitely a group effort per se.
Right.
And, partners, Game and Parks being a part of it, University of Nebraska, Lincoln, University of Georgia. I mean, this is pretty cool. Again, folks, we've got Andrew Little, Assistant Professor of Wildlife and Habitat Management in the cabin today. So far, I know you guys have been out catching turkeys.
Sure. Yep.
You focused on the Panhandle and the Southwest now.
Yep. Up in the Shadron, Crawford area is one area, and then down there in the McCook, Trenton area.
So walk us through that. When I say capturing turkeys, what are you actually doing and how are you doing it?
We're not going out there we already going out with a net. We're not going out like a fishing net or anything like that. But
I envision butterfly net, but bigger.
So it's really in the wintertime especially, and that's when we target trapping because those birds are going to be flocked up in larger groups. And so we can go in there and we'll use kind of a combination. This year we used walk-in trap, so it's basically just a big trap the birds can literally walk in, and then we're sitting in a blind, a little ways away, and we can take and basically drop the doors in that walk-in trap, and the birds are inside. And then we can take those birds out and put them in turkey boxes and start working them up from there.
So when the door is shut, the fun begins.
The fun begins. That's right. Yeah,
I can't believe anything but kind, honest Nebraska turkeys just sitting there. It's like, all right, Andy, my turn. Pull feathers, take a blood sample, put something on my leg, back, whatever you need to do, but go for it.
And it's a pretty, once we get the birds captured and put them in the turkey boxes, the National Wild Turkey Federation, we purchased from them. Then basically process them. We're putting the GPS transmitter on them, collecting some samples, and then off they go.
So folks, if you haven't already seen it, this is in the latest issue of Nebraska Land. This is the April 2023 edition. You get to page 42, I believe it is, and it's got some pictures. Now, describe why this sock is over that turkey head. Is that new in fashion? Is that something we can expect coming to a woods near you, or what?
No, that's used to basically reduce the stress of the bird during the handling process. So we want to be able to take and reduce that stress as much as possible. At the university, we work with our Institute of Animal Care and Use committee, and we basically have to go through a process, a protocol we have to have established, and that's part of that process to reduce that stress on the birds. So.
And so do you go to, wildturkeyproducts.com to get that special sock, or did you have a grad student snipping off the ends of?
The latter, yep. Yeah, latter, going to Walmart and getting some socks, and we take and use them. They work really well, and then just that helps with the processing, again, from reducing that stress, and then afterwards the bird goes. Go. We obviously get those back before we release the bird, so they're not running around there with them.
So they're reusable.
So, yeah. So.
Once again, Kayla, we're exploring an area that they never talked about at the high school job fair. How are your scissor skills? Can you put socks on turkeys?
Everybody bring in your old socks and a pair of scissors. So how you mentioned there's methodology or kind of reviews of the methods you have to follow to care for the birds once you capture them. And, with those, you mentioned the walk-in traps. Are there other methods then you're using to trap them?
Yeah, so the other one that we'll use for next year is actually going to be drop nets. And so drop nets, they are basically suspended above the ground. Again, we're sitting a little ways away, and then we can just drop the net on the birds, and then we can run up there, and then we can begin processing them from there. So
how long are your techs or your grad students out there waiting in blinds for it? Can it be?
It depends. It could be out there for hours. The one thing that's been really nice is we have now cell cams, and so cell cams can really help us. We can put those at sites, and again, if you get coverage, it depends on where you're at.
Right.
But if you can get coverage, you can have them to kind of say, okay, the birds are coming around, 1 to 3. Therefore, we want to be out there a little before 1 to be ready to go.
Yeah.
So
be a little more concise and
correct.
And
you're not sitting out there for like 10, 12 hours a day.
Well, especially with some of the weather.
Sure.
Nebraska's got. I'm sure that's thrown a wrench in some of the the planning.
Well, what they just get? They're like 8 or 10 inches the other day up there in Chadron. So.
Yes, they did, and it felt bad while we were sitting here in 70 degrees.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. But and part of it is genetic. You're looking at some turkey genetics as
well.
So doing a blood draw when you capture them.
Yep, we'll do a blood draw, and then the other cooperator, Dr. Sarah Sonstegen, who's really overall leading the effort in this project through the Nebraska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. That's part of her expertise, and looking at basically how, from the genetic side, even how this landscape structure influences how these birds are moving, and is there, are you seeing that genetic flow basically across the landscape of those populations? So she's more of an expert in that than I am.
All right. And does every turkey get a leg band and the GPS?
Yep. Every one that we're tagging, we'll take and put a leg band on them. So especially, all the birds have my actual phone number on there. So people call me if they, like, for example, if a male's harvested in the spring, they would end up calling me and saying, hey, I got a bird, and here's the number, and then we would get some information from them, and then they could keep that band. But then we do need to get the transmitter back.
Those aren't cheap.
Yeah, those are not cheap. But it's a pretty simple process in that sense. And then once the birds are released, then our students go to tracking them across the landscape for the next several months. So,
and I've called them GPS collars, but that's not what they are. I mean that's what you use for some big game animals. But birds, is it more like a backpack?
It is. Yeah, it's exactly a backpack. It's just a little tiny, couple inch size transmitter, and it's basically like a little small box. You'd stick, probably like an inch by like 2 inches. And has like a little antenna coming off the back. Actually, I think there might be some pictures. If if the viewers have that magazine, they can check it out and see some in there. But it's just a backpack, literally like your kiddo would put a backpack on to go to school. It's that idea that's wrapped around their wings, and then they can fly off, and we can track them.
And how long do those usually last for? Will they last for several years, or do you have to replace them every year?
That's a good question. So it really depends on how often you're getting GPS locations. The new ones that we're using from a company that's based out of Germany, they actually they have an accelerometer in them. So they actually, like your phone, tracking you and kind of say, hey, you're actually moving or you're not. That helps in basically determining the locations that it's taking on a regular basis, and that obviously influences the battery. They're also solar powered, so that helps in recharging that battery. So the length of time, I would say, is at least a year. They're suggesting potentially we can get up to 2 years of data on them, and that's been one of the limitations for a lot of turkey research is, especially in the olden days, even when I did my PhD on wild turkeys, it was the VHF, the old school, listen with the antenna and hearing the beeps out there.
Yeah.
And those units really wouldn't get past a year and then they would be dead. Or you could get maybe a year and a half, but they start really wearing out over time because that battery is so small and such a small unit you got to put out there. So.
So how many turkeys do you have outfitted with GPS and leg bands right now?
So right now, I think we're at probably about 90 birds right now, collectively across both areas. So
all right.
Yep.
Well, I heard started out in the Northwest.
Started out in the
Panhandle.
Northwest. Yep, and then we moved our way down into the
Found some
Southwest.
snow. There's snow in the picture,
which is a huge help. So it gets those birds into those traps because they're looking for food.
And are you still trapping some down the Southwest? I know it was kind of down there. Their birds are kind of ahead. They're haven't been near as cold.
Yeah. So we're done actually trapping now. So trapping's over as things are warming up. It's just getting harder. The birds are dispersing as we're getting into the hunting season now and kind of moving off. And so it gets a little more logistically challenging to get into April.
Oh,
so
cool. And I've heard, talked to Maduna, there we go. Luke Maduna, I'm combining his name. By the way, his dad's retiring at the end of this week. Right. So, Bob, if you're listening, congratulations on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
For all those years. But Luke was saying that, if a hunter is, harvest one of those gobblers that has this stuff, we need, like you said, we need the GPS back.
Yep.
Give us the information. That's part of the science and part of the project as well. So make sure you let us know. I mean, that's going to help out quite a bit.
Yep.
So keep
that'll
your eyes
help
out
with that'll help with harvest and kind of looking at that harvest rates as well as we're collecting. And this is, like you said, is a multi-year study. So the next 2 years, we're going to continue to tag and put more GPS transmitters out on birds across the landscape.
So I got to assume already, though, you guys are watching those beats. I mean, it's one of those things. All right, you put a trail camera out, you put a trap out. I mean, it's all sorts of stuff. It's like, what's happening? What's happening right now? I want to know.
Sure.
Are you starting to collect? Obviously, you are collecting data, but are we seeing enough there to?
Yeah. We're obviously pretty early on in all this, we, in general, we're definitely seeing those birds disperse, and I think hunters are already seeing that as well. Starting to break out of those typical winter flocks. I think a number, especially if you're maybe up in the Northwest, the birds are still a little gathered up in flocks because of the snow. But in general, they're starting to break up, and you'll start seeing it. And I kind of liken it to the idea of kind of like a disease spreads. Basically they're in a group, and then they begin to kind of break out into smaller and smaller groups because essentially those hens. In particular, are going to start moving to find nesting areas where they're going to set up a nest, and so they got to. It's pretty cool to see.
Isn't that unique? I mean, you got turkeys that are a flock bird. Yep. That especially the hens and last year's hatchlings, if you want to call them that, the poults.
Yeah.
I mean, they're together. I mean, they're made for finding food together, keeping everyone apprised of dangers. More eyes, the better they have of survival. And then all of a sudden, breeding season comes by and nature says, spread out.
Yep.
Get away from each other. Yep. Where you have great blue herons, on the other hand, which are pretty solitary, and then all of a sudden they nest together in rookery. Yep. So strategies, that's pretty neat. So you're starting to see a little bit of that happening
we are.
On the landscape.
Yeah, we had, and particularly the males are moving a lot more, which is not surprising. You would expect that as they're starting to break up and moving into some of these other potential areas where they're going to be, looking for potential females for breeding.
So what was the selection for the birds you put up transmitters on and grab data from? Is there like a ratio of male to female?
Yeah, we tried
to adults. Or?
Yeah, so on the juvenile adult, it was kind of what we got in the trap kind of thing. We basically targeted. We wanted to have at least 40 females and then 20 males, and so it was the target was getting about 60 birds approximately in a region. And then basically we're going to replicate that for the next couple of years. So in theory, over the next 3 years, we could have about 360 birds with GPS transmitters on them across the landscape, which is a lot of data. So
did you eliminate the birds that kept walking into the trap? Did we recapture? You're not going to help us out, but we'll take that transmitter back.
Trap happy, type thing, No, I think most of them, once you captured it at a site, most of them weren't going to likely come back in there. They realized, I don't know if I want to come back into that again.
But you see them ban geese, and every once in a while you know that that's the same goose they banned 3 years ago. You can see the smile on its face here.
And we might have birds next year and next couple of years that we do capture again. So and then we'll in that case probably just put a new transmitter on them to ensure we can continue to have that continuity of data. Because again, that battery we don't know how long it'll actually last. So
so predation by hunters will obviously be one thing you're looking at. Looking at once you see those transmit stop, or you've got them, are you going to be looking at some causes of predation in the study too? Then?
Yeah, we'll be doing that. Yeah, so not only from the standpoint of, basically looking at that data, we can then say, hey, we got a big pile of GPS points on top of another, and so we can go in there and inspect and see what potentially was the cause of mortality for that bird, if it's obviously outside of a hunter, so like something like a coyote or some other type of predator in the landscape. And then from there, being able to look at it from camera data around basically nesting areas and basically kind of what we call random or non-nesting areas. So looking at basically what are those predator communities, particularly those mesopredator communities around those areas. And just again, like we said, it's kind of we're trying to gather a lot of information about and basically a species that we don't have a ton of information on per se. So.
Pretty cool. Now, I also know that part of this, or at least a branch of it, is you guys are going to start putting microphones out in the woods.
Yeah.
Has that begun yet?
We have. Yeah, it's already done. So they're already out there in the landscape. Yep. Yeah.
What are those microphones called? Because I know it's not just a lapel sitting out there.
Yeah. It's called an acoustic recording unit. So those are designed to basically look at, in this case, gobbling activity, or what we're kind of looking at is kind of like the timing of gobbling. So when are those males starting to gobble, and how does that then in turn correspond to that nesting season? So in other words, are we seeing a lot of that gobbling activity we assume kind of right before the birds are spending a lot of time, particularly the hens, starting to nest? But what does that look like? And we, again, just don't really have much information to really go off of. But again, a lot of this is built out of other studies and down the southeast where they're doing a lot of that work, and then they can even look at impacts of hunting pressure on gobbling activity. Basically how weather impacts gobbling activity, that kind of stuff. And so we'll be able to dive into some of that information based on how we lay these units out in the landscape.
Oh, that's going to be intriguing to say the least, because, one of the things you hear about, especially in the turkey world, as our listeners can attest, is just that, we hear so much about subspecies in turkeys and the hybridization and all that type of stuff, and just the different environments that they live in. If you look at Georgia and the southeast, those thick rolling woods or mountains or West Virginia, and then you get up here to the plains and the prairie areas of Nebraska, and they still have turkeys adapted for two completely different systems. To see what similarities there are, what differences, all that type of stuff. So, that will be neat. So you've already started listening in.
Yeah.
Now I got to assume that you don't have a research grad student just sitting there and listening.
We did in the olden days. We did. And
there's the gobble. All right, we're 2 hours in. First gobble. All right, what?
So now it's using machine learning. So so fancy computer engineered software that can basically go through and basically pick out those individual gobbles. And so that's another part of this collaboration with University of Georgia and Dr. Patrick Whiteman, who is a postdoc down there working for Dr. Mike Chamberlain. That was actually his PhD project, diving into a lot of that gobbling chronology type work in Georgia. And now basically taking that model and being able to apply that to other states. And so they're working with us to be able to train those models to then send them all this data, and then they'll analyze all that data and look at that timing and create those kind of peaks in gobbling activity here in Nebraska.
So are those acoustic devices, are those outfitted on the birds themselves or on the landscape? They're
on the landscape. They're basically attached to trees. We'll basically put them, and we kind of put about a 1.5 to 2 mile distance between each of the units out in the landscape. So we worked a lot with landowners. So thanks to all the landowners that have been a huge supporter and part of this project, getting things rolling. Obviously, state and federal lands as well. And then, so we have those units on a tree, and then we have an antenna that goes about 20 feet up into the tree. Oh, wow. And then that's basically recording all that information down to that unit. And so there's an SD card in there, and it's storing all that data for us.
Yeah.
So then the students go out every probably 2 to 3 weeks and just check battery levels and pull those SD cards out, and then we can send all that data down to Georgia.
Very, very cool. I'm sure a lot of planning. Are those, so the selection of those sites then just to try to cover the expected range of where those birds are going to be based on where you trapped them at?
Yeah. So part of it was we wanted to be able to have a pretty good distribution of those two different areas, southwest and northwest parts of Nebraska, and so we worked a lot with game and parks biologists in those different areas to identify particular locations we wanted to put those up.
Sure.
So yeah,
that's something I was interested in when I first heard of it, and it'll be very interesting to see how that stacks up against all the other data you collect too, because it's going to be very, I'm sure, putting the pieces together will be the fun part.
Yeah, that to me, because I really love to focus on the movements and what kind of habitat types they're selecting and that kind of stuff. But really, at the end of the day, one of the big things for me out of this project is how can we translate this back to landowners and their implementation of management to help turkeys in the landscape, especially in this intensive agricultural system that we're in. So,
that's pretty cool. Now, I know mythology. You guys really follow that, and you guys don't leave anything to chance. Sure. When they're going in to get those SD cards and check batteries, I'm guessing you've got a time frame when you tell them to go do that. I'm guessing they're not going to bump them off the roost tree in the morning.
Sure, yeah. They're and it's kind of up to the students, the technicians are out there. They're not going to be going in super early in the morning to do that. And they'll probably around lunchtime or whatever to get in there and do it. So it's kind of up to them based on their field schedule. But they're also downloading data from the transmitters, because that's one of the things that's unique with these smaller transmitters. You have to put on, so we have a project right now, Game and Parks on Pronghorn, and those collars that are out there, they're collecting data, and then they send it to satellite, and then we tap into a server, and we can get that data, almost automatically where those animals are at. With these transmitters, because they're small, we have to have that data stored on the unit, and then we have to go in and find that bird through an antenna and connect to basically that unit. And essentially, it basically downloads us all the data. So we have to go to the field to get the data back. In other words,
it's like Bluetooth, but
sure, it's exactly what. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So how close do you have to get to them? Any idea? Are we talking?
Yeah, it kind of depends. I think we're trying to get somewhere within a couple hundred yards or so of the bird to download that data. You can be a little bit further, but you run the risk if there's any topography there. That may affect your ability to download that data. So.
So as we get into kind of later spring, summer here, as those clutches start hatching, are they going to be collecting data off the birds that they see? I mean, if you're only a couple hundred yards away, you'll be able to see them.
Sure, yeah, so absolutely. So particularly, the nest data will be collecting. So obviously, for turkeys, they have a basically incubation period of about 28 days that those hens will be on that nest unless something predates the nest. Once those birds hatch that brood out, then the students are going to be monitoring that brood. So with that female over the course of the first 2 weeks, because that's one of the things for turkeys, the first 2 weeks of life, those poults is basically a flightless stage. So their mom and them have to stay on the ground for about 2 weeks. So obviously that's a pretty risky time, potential predation and such. But once they get past about 2 weeks, they can physically fly up in a tree. So basically, the students are going to be monitoring that initial, couple weeks or so of that brood stage as they're on the ground.
Isn't it amazing? Again, back to adaptation. Once they can fly, jump up into those small trees, bushes, their survival rate increases. What we've always been told. So. Yeah, man, this is quite interesting. So maybe we look into this a little bit more for those again. Listen, this is Andrew Little, Assistant Professor of Wildlife and Habitat Management at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, and I'm tossing out UNL just for Michaela, who we argue back and forth. Is it NU or UNL? So, but anyhow, what are some other states? What have they shown? Because I know there's quite a stir been caused by some of the research and learning what we didn't know.
Sure, yeah. So a lot of the other states are really kind of on a similar path in trying to address these declines in their states. A lot of people again, this is the idea of standardizing data across states, and so a lot of people are looking at movements of their turkeys in the landscape. How far are they moving? What types of cover are they spending time in? Where are they nesting at? So there's a lot of similarities between other states and what we're seeing here in our state. But one of the big things I think has been really, two big keys that have come out in the past, probably 5 to 10 years of research is nest and brood rearing cover are really, really critical for the success of those populations. So we obviously have to have high quality nest and brood rearing cover during that spring into the early summer phase to ensure we can get those broods into that, eventually adulthood as they move into the fall population. So,
all right. And then on the gobbling side, we're probably not the first people to be attaching microphones to trees.
No, so a lot of the data, you can definitely see an impact of hunting pressure. For example, if you're on like WMAs or highly hunted areas, those birds, and I think a lot of hunters can, attest to this. When you're out there, eventually the birds, they feel like they just shut up and they quit gobbling after a while. There's some other studies to actually look at, and one in Louisiana I'm familiar with, where they actually gave hunters GPS units, and then they also had tracked where the birds were at. And so most hunters obviously wouldn't go very far off the road because they want to hang out in the road. One, just to, hey, I'll stop here, listen. If I hear a bird, then I'll head in. But most of the time, most hunters didn't go very far off the road. So kind of the moral out of that story was, hey, get farther off the road, get back in a little further, get away from where everybody else is at. So, yeah, yep.
I'm always nervous of those being that hunter that has that GPS, especially if the turkey's got one on it too, and just seeing how close they get so far. And I move 5 steps, and that turkey moves 10 steps, and then just back and forth. How close we can be without even knowing they're there.
Sure. Yeah, I did some of that research on white-tailed deer and for my master's in Oklahoma, doing exactly that same thing. And it was always kind of fun because you look at that data later on and you'd see, oh, well, this deer literally was hanging right out where that hunter was at, but they never saw it. So, and then you start wondering yourself, and I'm a big deer hunter, and it's like, well, how many deer did I miss when I'm out there in the field? So.
Yeah, sometimes, ignorance is bliss.
Sure. It's true.
There's not a darn turkey on this property at all. But that's pretty interesting. So, how many years are we looking at?
So this is a 4.5-year project with the agency. So yeah, very fortunate and blessed to be able to work with the agency, and excited to see all the data pouring in and be able to address these questions. So one thing you mentioned before, management implication, landowners managing, their land for success and breeding success, and obviously survival as well. But forward looking at some of the states that have done some or similar research and some of the management implications that have, ideas that, especially at the state fish and wildlife level, have there been any major changes to season structure? Obviously here in Nebraska, we've got some changes in how we're structuring or what we're doing with regulations in our turkey seasons. Have you seen that in other states then? Yeah, there's been some other states. I know Tennessee, for example, they've implemented some changes in their structure, and so I think they're starting a little bit later in how their season, when their opening date is. Part of that is to then try to get some of these females, hens that bred before those males are harvested on the landscape. So trying to, again, kind of push that a little further. The challenge, the juggle is, hunters obviously want to get out there early on, and so trying to find that balance the best they can from the state agency with the constituents they're working with. So that's one example. There's been some other examples of, just trying to reduce that bag limit, which obviously the agency has done here in Nebraska, and basically hopes to try to reduce that impact in the population and keep that sustainable in the long term. So other states have been doing that type of work.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting because it's obviously a balance of what the hunters want, but also what needs to be done in the landscape to sustain populations at that level. And it'll be, I'm sure, a lot of good data that can be put to use by not only the university, the landowners, also the game and parks, and some of the other partners that are all involved in this project. So it's kind of cool to see that it's not just the university doing it or game and parks, or we got a lot of different stakeholders at play here,
which is important because I think that's really how you address big challenges like this, and especially, and that's what our lab focuses a lot on, is how do we find those balances? Because when you're a producer, and I meet a lot with producers, and saying, hey, my number one thing is maximizing the profitability of my system here. Wildlife may not necessarily be a top priority for some individuals, and so how can we find those balances that we can really help kind of bridge both realms? And we can do that, and especially nowadays with precision conservation and precision ag technology. So,
And it definitely is going to be interesting. And as we started this conversation, I've said we've kind of a lot of times looked at turkeys just like we do with pheasants.
Sure.
And we're finding out that not necessarily in some cases, if you harvest that mature tom that is kind of, towards the top of the pecking order, might not be another one moves in real fast.
Sure, it might take a little bit of time. And I know Mike has been working on that in Georgia and some other states, and that's been some of the questions. If we take and we harvest these dominant males, and how long does it take? And they're currently in the process of working through some of that information right now. But again, how long does it take to kind of reshuffle? We assume it's almost instantaneous.
We sure did for many years.
But it seems to take a little bit longer than kind of an instantaneous approach, and then that potentially has implications for the birds.
And on the hunter side of it, it's just like, all right, maybe there might be more gobbles or something like that because the big bird's gone, or it might get quieter there as they kind of adjust. But one thing we might be seeing is that some of those hens then kind of push nesting back a little bit while the pecking order
Sure.
a huge significance.
Sure, absolutely.
It's reestablished, and every time they push it back, again, back to those adaptations, and man, this is why they want to nest now, because the resources when the poults hatch are there for soft-bodied bugs and all that stuff. So
absolutely.
Interesting thing, to say the least, and as I know our listeners know, the more information our wildlife managers have to draw from and make recommendations then to our full commission, the better. Having full knowledge and as much as we can get anyway.
Sure. Well, that's one of my,
helps.
like I said, that's one of my passions in life, is to ensure we get that information shared and help those land managers, help agencies be able to make those changes in the landscape that they need to do, and working with our producers or landowners to be able to find ways to kind of maximize both the production and the conservation sides. So
there you go. Now, Western Nebraska, kind of the center point of it right now. Any chance we might be able to expand here to the eastern side of the state?
Yeah, you'll have to talk with Luke and others about that. I think my hope is we can do that at some point down the road. I think it's a good starting point in Western Nebraska, and particularly part of the reason we chose, especially in the Southwest, is that's where they were seeing some of the most significant declines based on the data that the agency was collecting. So that's part of that, and then basically, hopefully in the future, is kind of maybe rolling that to some other places like you're saying here in the eastern part of the state. But again, that'll be up to the agency if that's the the choice moving forward. But hopefully so.
I mean, just the diversity of turkeys and habitat from one side of the other, north to south, east to west in this state, just phenomenal.
Sure.
And that's kind of fun. Now we get into more personal things. Do you turkey hunt?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm looking forward to the shotgun opener. Should have been out archery hunting already. So.
Well, it's kind of hard when you go from, beautiful 60-degree day down to like 30 again, then back up to 70. And then today when we're in the studio, it's kind of chilly out there.
Sure.
And then you look at the long-term forecast, there's like near 90 degrees.
I saw that next week. Oh, my goodness. Going right to summer already.
Oh, yeah. You just don't know what to dress. You're going to have to start taking a suitcase with you in the woods so you can add the parka, take it off, get into the shorts, whatever you need to do.
Sure.
So, this will definitely be interesting. Now, where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Pennsylvania. Grew up there. Yeah.
I knew it. Now that you said it, that was what I was going to say.
Usually I get are you from the South? Because you sound like you're from Georgia or something. Well, I spent a number of years down there. I think about 10 years in the South, in Mississippi, and then over in Georgia. But yeah, I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania and went to Penn State. Big rivalry here with Nebraska.
Wow. Are you a Nittany Lion, really?
I am. But the really comical thing I like to tell people is back in the 90s, I would play on Sega Genesis, I don't remember what Madden version it was back then, but it was, I'd play college football and I say Madden, but really college football. I always would play the Huskers and then I'd play the Nittany Lions. Really? And it was always, and then, come full circle and I'm out here. My wife, though, she actually is from Hastings, Nebraska. So there's a connection here to Nebraska. So.
All right. Got good taste. Then all right, we'll go with that.
Yeah. Yep. So.
All right. Well, you guys got any more questions? Do you have any more things you want to add to this? I mean, this is quite.
This has been fun. Yeah. It's like I said, it's a lot of different pieces that we're putting together. I kind of liken it a lot of times to just a complex puzzle. And one of the things and Mike has a really good analogy in thinking about the football field. And you have a football field, and we'll think about the Huskers, and we have. A quarterback could be really important in one game, and then you could have a wide receiver being really important in another game, and then your defensive line is really important in another game. You're going to have various players that are going to be really important at various times, and that's one of the things you think about that analogy with turkeys is that you could be at one property and it could be one thing driving that population, positive or negative, and then you go 5-10 miles down the road and it could be something totally different. And I like that analogy he uses because it really illustrates the complexity that we're dealing with in the landscape. It's not, we're not a cookie cutter approach type of thing that we can use one place can always work somewhere else because it's just very complex in nature. I always like to tell people, we're not in a chemistry lab where we can control things, to the nth degree. We got a lot of uncertainty out there in the landscape, and that's why it makes it complex. So.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Well, I know we're going to have to get you back in as we learn a little bit more and see the wanderings of these turkeys this first spring. That's really going to be intriguing because, again, you've got birds that do seem to kind of hang out in one area.
Sure.
Don't have to go very far to find what they need or what they're looking for. And then you've got those birds out west that you'll be looking around just like, where do these birds even come from. There's no roost sites for miles out here. So that will be interesting. So thanks for being a part of today's conversation.
Yep, absolutely. Glad to be on here.
All right, we're going to put a bow on it right there, folks. Again, give us a thumbs up, a subscribe, however you need to do it so you know when the next Hunt Nebraska drops. Until next time.
Hunt Nebraska, brought to you by your Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.